The little professor ventured toward the captain's desk and began a statement.
Captain Murphy, I believe that I have a plan that might be well to use in the capture of the...
Murphy let go with his usual explosion.
Now, wait a minute. Stop. Stop right where you are.
But, my dear Captain, I believe that the art of pretense should be used in tripping up...
The captain banged his fist on the desk.
Don't give me that monkey business about pretending again. $2 million worth of paintings have been stole from the Beaux Art Museum, and no amount of bluffing is going to bring them back to me.
The little man clucked his tongue and shook his head.
But, Captain, I'm led to believe that only one man is perpetrating these daring robberies.
Yes, and I'm led to believe that if you don't get out of here, I'm going to have you thrown out. Now, are you going to go?
Cosmo shook his head. No. And the captain carried out his threat. Remembering only too well the little man's adeptness with the jiu-jitsu, Murphy yelled for Flanagan, Riley, Maloney, and O'Brien. The door of an inner office opened, and the 4 burly policemen stepped in. Murphy pointed a finger at Cosmo.
Put this gibbering little idiot out in the hall, but handle him gently or you might hurt him.
One officer took Cosmo by the right arm, another took him by the left. Still another took him by the scruff of his neck, and the last one grabbed him by the seat of his pants. Holding him at arm's length, the officers opened the door, thrust him lightly outside, and shut it quickly. Murphy settled back in his chair.
Well, that settles that.
But the tantalizing little man had a taunting remark up his sleeve. The door opened again, and Cosmo shoved his head in. He smiled slyly at the open-mouthed police official and said,
Just think, Captain Murphy. It took 4 of your big, strong policemen to put me out.
With that, he was gone. And Captain Murphy flew into a frenzy that bordered on an epileptic fit. Throwing his head back and holding his nose snootily in the air, Cosmo marched past the disgusted sergeant at the reception desk and on into the street. It was still early evening, and the professor turned his footsteps toward the downtown section of the big city and dolefully moved along, gradually settling his mind in a state of deep thought. As he shuffled through the hurrying helter-skelter of humanity, he dwelt on the probability of what might be best to do. When eventually an idea formed in his mind, he was so preoccupied that he came to a dead stop right where he was and remarked out loud,
I know what I shall do. I shall go to the museum.
It so happened that this thought came to the little man right in the middle of the street. He took one look at the 6 or more gasoline juggernauts bearing down on him and made a headlong dive for the curb. He made it all right, yes, and grinned with embarrassment at the score of passers-by, who paused momentarily to gaze at him, then continued on their way with dubious shakings of the head. But Cosmo shuffled along without indignation, realizing only too well that people were quick to recognize the blunders of everybody but themselves. In reviewing the newspaper details of the museum robberies, Cosmo remembered that in each instance of thievery, a valuable painting had been removed from its frame and replaced with a worthless imitation. The mystery was further complicated by the fact that the police had been on guard for the past several weeks, on the lookout for a band of men who might be the criminals. But there had been no cars, no trucks, or groups of men seen loitering about the huge building, which gave Cosmo reason to believe that the crimes were being committed by one man. And the fact that the priceless works of art were being replaced by worthless replicas made the little professor feel sure. Yes, surely it must be. It was an artist, or at least a would-be artist, possibly seeking revenge for... Wait a minute. If Cosmo's memory served him correctly... Yes, that was it. He would check it immediately. The little man quickened his pace and headed for a Times newspaper branch office only 2 blocks away. Arriving there, he quickly scanned through the file of previous editions and... Yes, there it was. An account of the Beaux Art Museum turning down the paintings of an artist who had submitted works more than a month ago. Cosmo decided that he might be on the right trail. The details of how he would get his man could be worked out later. He headed for the museum as fast as his scrawny little legs would carry him. While he cut down the distance toward his destination, he remembered that it was every other day that the paintings had been missed toward the early part of the evening. There were hardly any visitors in the massive structure at that time, just after the dinner hour, which would make it easy to complete a switch of the pictures. Yesterday, there was no report of a missing piece, which would make tonight the logical time for another attempt. Cosmo puffed his way up the long, sweeping flight of stone steps and entered the great portico of the museum. Once inside, he took note of the fact that, just as he had expected, there were only a few stray visitors. His beady little eyes traveled over the main hall of art. He noticed the many entrances to little passageways that wound around and throughout the wings of the museum building. Ah, yes, indeed. He could easily understand the possibility of hiding in this maze of niches and corridors where the beautiful paintings of the world's great artists hung in mute tribute to these. Cosmo stationed himself in a patient vigil near the giant entrance and watched for the few stragglers who came in. From time to time, whenever a man who looked like he might be an artist entered, Cosmo would approach, and while he patted the arms and sides of the visitors in a seeming gesture of goodwill, he would go into the business of saying, "Well, well, well, if it isn't my good friend, Dr. Demikoff. It's been years since I've seen you." The stranger, of course, would shake himself from the professor's grasp, mutter something about he must be making a mistake, and hurry away. After annoying people quite a number of times this way, Cosmo was warned by one of the few attendants to discontinue this practice, and the man went on to say that if he didn't, well, the police who were on their way to the museum for an investigation of the robberies would be notified. But the professor didn't stop his monkey shines. And when a sad-faced gentleman was made subject to the professor's impromptu frisking, he immediately shoved the little man away. But not before Cosmo felt the odd and unusual bulge under the man's overcoat. At last he had him. Then, as luck would have it, Murphy and his blue coat surged through the doorway, and Cosmo was in a mess. The attendant spilled the beans, and Murphy roared.
"Well, I see you're up to your screwball tricks again. What's your excuse this time?"
Cosmo tried to quiet the irate policeman. Now, Captain Murphy, I have the solution to everything. I've caught your thief for you."
"Yeah? Where is he?"
The professor turned and pointed his finger at empty space. In the excitement of explanation, Cosmo's suspect had disappeared. Seeing the professor point at nothing was enough for Murphy.
"I'm convinced. I always thought you were a lunatic, but now I'm sure of it. Flanagan, grab him."
And Flanagan made his mistake. He made a lunge, but before he could draw a second breath, his 200-pound frame went sailing through the air. Cosmo started off on a run, and Murphy yelled,
"Get him! What do you mean, get him? And all of you stay inside. This building's surrounded."
Everybody started running in all directions as the spry little fellow vanished through the maze of hallways. He headed for a flight of stairs and gained the second floor, skittering along for all he was worth until his attention was arrested by an object. He spotted the empty shell of a knight's armor and immediately headed for it. Hurriedly, he laid down his familiar walking stick and umbrella behind the low pedestal, flung off his huge overcoat, and dropped it in a monster vase. Then he tugged at the helmet of the suit of armor and lowered it over his head, propping up the visor. Next came the great chest plate, and by the time he had wriggled his legs into the armor that normally goes around the thigh, Cosmo discovered that the leg section that should have ended at his knee was down around his ankles. He had enough room in the thing to take up light housekeeping. Then, to make matters worse, as he started for the pedestal, the visor of the helmet dropped down over his eyes, and Cosmo gave a fine performance of a bold knight playing blind man's buff. He tugged at the visor with both hands, and unconsciously, his feet began to wander. Yes, he made it all right. The top of the grand staircase. One foot stepped off into space, and the result? He came to rest at the bottom of the staircase, with his suit of armor dented in more than a dozen different places, and a vague memory of knocking something over on the way down. At the sound of the terrific racket, Murphy and a crowd of his officers came on the run. Cosmo could hear him bellowing.
"Grab both of them. Wait a minute. This one guy's knocked cold. Well, now let's see who's in the iron tank."
The professor could feel himself being mauled around roughly. Then Murphy spoke again.
"For the love of Mike, this thing is so buckled and bent that we can't get him out. Somebody get a hammer and a hacksaw, will you?"
There was quite a bit of commotion, and the little man was propped into a sitting position. The police captain asked a question.
"Whoever you are in there, speak up, will you? Who are you?"
Cosmo revealed his identity.
"It's me, Captain Murphy."
Well, how in the name of all the saints did you get in there?
Really, Captain Murphy, I'll have to admit that I've made a rather bad job of tonight's business, but it's nobody's fault but your own.
At this point, several officers returned with the hammers, and Murphy supervised the job of extricating Cosmo.
All right, men, get to work on him. But be careful you don't bash in his head. That's my privilege.
Captain Murphy! Captain Murphy!
At the sound of the little fellow's plaintive outcry, the captain interrupted the destruction project.
Well, what is it?
Be careful not to hammer the helmet. I have a very bad case of epistaxis.
What kind of taxes?
Not taxes, epistaxis.
Murphy scratched his head.
And will you be telling me what kind of a disease is that?
It's not a disease. It's a nosebleed.
After several minutes of sweating, the police finally succeeded in freeing the bedraggled little man. And the minute he got out, he recognized the unconscious figure on the floor as that of his suspect of the early part of the evening. Murphy gave credit where it was due.
Sure it's the thief, all right. He just knocked him cold on the way down the stairs while he was on his way up making a getaway. And we found he just switched another painting under his coat when we landed with a crack of the noggin on the marble floor here.
The captain stooped and picked up the remains of the suit of armor.
If yous ask me, this was the craziest thing you ever tried to hide in. Are yous hurt in any way at all?
Why, no, Captain Murphy. I'm all right.
Murphy let out a sigh of relief.
Whew. Well, I'm certainly glad of that.
A look of surprise crossed over Cosmo's face.
So, Captain Murphy, it finally comes out. You really do like me after all.
Get him out of my sight. Get him out of my sight before I lose my mind.